you're wondering, oh my heavens to Betsy, why is she reading from Job? Were you paying attention? Did you think it was a misprint? Usually in this season, in this Advent season, we read from Isaiah, or this year we would be reading from Jeremiah. And so we read from Jeremiah when we lit the Advent candle, but this passage in Job just hit me right between the eyes, and I said, let's do Job. Are you ready?
Yes.
How many of you are Job scholars? Reading from chapter 4, beginning with verse 1. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered, "If one ventures a word with you, Job, will you be offended? But who can keep from speaking? See, you have instructed many. You have strengthened the weak hands. Your words, Job, have supported those who were stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the majesty of your ways your hope?" Thus ends the reading. Now, the reason we hate this story is because we think it's a story about suffering, don't we? I mean, if you don't know anything about Job, what do you know about Job? Suffering. He's suffering. You know, one day 4 messengers showed up at his house and said, all of your land has been destroyed, all of your cattle has been destroyed, all of your children have been killed. Huh? And all because of, can I read it from you on? This story is just...
Do as God says.
I'm going to read it to you. Satan answered the Lord. Satan was God's buddy in the story, okay? One of the heavenly council. And, you know, and this God asked Satan, "So where have you been, Satan?" And Satan says, "Well, you know, I've come back from traveling about on the earth." And God says to Satan, "Well, you know, Satan, what do you think of my servant Job? Ain't he terrific?" And Satan says, "Well, yeah, he's pretty good, but there is no one like him on the earth. He's blameless and an upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." And Satan answers God, "Well, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will cause you, and he will curse you to your face." So that niggling presence of Satan somehow, as we read this story, cons God into doing something rotten to Job. And then there's this next passage where one day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came, and God said, "So where have you been, Satan?" And Satan said, "Well, I've been traveling about on the earth." And God says, "Well, you know, what do you think of my servant Job? You know, all this stuff has happened to him, and he still praises my name." And Satan says, "Skin for skin, all that people have, they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." So here is this scene, what I read to you today. Job, who is covered head to foot, inflicted with loathsome sores, as it is described in the book, all over his body, covered with ashes, seated on the ground. Everything lost. The only person left in his life is his wife and his friends. And he's sitting there saying, "Let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said a man-child is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine on it. Why is light given to one who cannot see the way, whom God has fenced in? For my sighing comes like my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. Truly, the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes." Through the next chapters of the book of Job, there are conversations between Job and his friends, and Job is defending himself before God. Job makes his defense before God, unable to understand why what has befallen him has befallen him. Now, what I want to do, and what Gerald Jansen does, God bless him, is he opens this up and makes it not so much a story of one man. Rather, this is a story, he says, that probably took place at the time of the exile, when the Israelites' city of Jerusalem was destroyed and people were marched from their home into Assyria, into Mesopotamia, where they became the slaves of the Babylonian Empire. So please imagine, if you will, that Job is Israel. Job is the nation of Israel in exile, and covered with ashes, having lost everything. And standing there going, how am I to have hope when all is destroyed? This story, God bless Gerald Jansen again, is not about suffering. It is a story about change. It is a story of a man who begins one way and struggles and is sorely troubled in his mind and in his heart and in his body. The sorest of troubles, trying to figure out why what has happened to him has happened to him. That horrible question, why? Why, God, have you done this to us? Why, God, have you abandoned us, the nation of Israel? Job. He stands there, arms out, imagine, the nation of Israel saying, God, why have you abandoned us? Where is our hope? Eliphaz the Temanite very clearly said, your hope is in your integrity. Your hope is in the self that is within you that has faith in God. The Job that begins the story is not the same Job that ends the story. The Job who speaks in chapter 3 is not the same Job who speaks in chapter 42. Job who says, I know, God, that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you declare to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. The Israel, Job, who complained and said, why, oh, why has this happened to me? In the end says, I did not understand who you were. I did not understand that everything that is comes from you, gracious God. And what right do I have to complain about anything? You have a plan for us. There's how many of you know the caterpillar? What the caterpillar does? The caterpillar, metamorphosis. The word I'm looking for is metamorphosis. And I'm going to give you a few examples of metamorphosis. You know, everybody says, oh, the caterpillar goes into the cocoon. And when the caterpillar's done metamorphing, then the caterpillar comes out of the cocoon, a beautiful butterfly. But you have no idea what goes on in that cocoon. Do you? You're not inside that cocoon with that butterfly, and you haven't got a clue what is going on inside that cocoon. How that poor butterfly, that poor caterpillar, is metamorphosing, changing in that cocoon. I think of the movie Altered States, and probably none of you have ever seen it. 1, 2, 3. Go rent it. A lovely, very handsome, gloriously beautiful William Hurt stars in the movie. You women are going to go out and get it right away. It's really this wonderful scene, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, William Hurt is a doctor who, it's a science fiction show. He's a doctor who decides he needs to explore the inner workings of humanity. He needs to do an anthropological study of where we came from, what our roots were. And he gets involved with taking these hallucinogenic drugs. And he goes into one of those, you know, those isolation tanks. You ever heard of those? Those isolation tanks where there's no stimulus, where you're just floating and there's nothingness. So what happens is he goes back to these primordial times in his head with the help of the drugs. And he goes back to these primordial times, and he has these visions of what he was as a human before there were humans that walked upright, but a human that was hunched over. And there is this scene where literally he begins to change into this human being, and there are muscles that are jumping in his body, and you're sitting there going, oh, that must be painful. And he is metamorphosing into this other being in this particular scene, and you're going, oh my God, that must be painful. The visual of his body going through that is what we are talking about here, what Israel is going through in their soul of souls, in their heart of heart, in their mind of minds, as they try to wrestle with their relationship with God, understanding that they must metamorphose themselves. They must change who they are in their relationship with God. They must understand more clearly who God is for their lives, and that God has everything that is hope in mind for God's people. There is hope for God's people in the midst of the horror that you experience in your everyday life. There is hope because your faith is in God. Every cruel thing that happens to you in this life, every painful thing that happens to you in this life, every pain you experience is not put upon you. It simply is. It is not Satan niggling at God saying, make that happen to them. No. It is what happens to us when God is our hope, always at the end of it. God is our hope that we will come through it. And there are people right here in this sanctuary today that can testify to that, can testify to the change they go through every week of their lives, every day. I heard Bill's story of change yesterday. Everybody has change going on in their lives. Our minds, John Wesley, God bless him, says that the sorest trouble we have is when our minds have a tendency to rework and overanalyze what's happening to us and why. And when we are troubled in mind, we can have a tendency to move away from God. And what Wesley says about Job is that Job is comparable to Jesus. When Jesus was confronted on the cross with that notion of abandonment, and he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? There was in that moment of confession where Jesus realized that he had been abandoned, that God's hope was there with him on the cross. And in that moment, he was able to say, here I am, and was able to give up his spirit. When we give up hope, we give up God. So we can never give up hope. We can never abandon ourselves to despair or complaint. We must always reconnect and change and metamorphose and get beyond overanalyzing what has happened to